If you've ever animated the character in step mode only to see these annoying wrist flips once you splined, well, you may have been hit by a smooth criminal called the gimbal lock. This is going to be more of a technical lesson to explain what's actually happening in the background and how you can fix or prevent it. Now, before we learn how to fix anything, we need to understand what a gimbal is. I think the whole system originates in mechanical engineering, but regardless, a gimbal lock is this ring with the 3 axes X, Y, and Z that we use for rotations. When animating, we tend to use the local space because it's the most intuitive, and when we rotate the hand in the local, things go as you would expect. The rotation is always facing the hand, and we can even click in the center and rotate from any direction inside of this rotation circle without any issues. Changing it to global or world space will keep the axis snapped to the world coordinates, which is great if you are, let's say, translating the body and you want to translate it in the world coordinates. That works great, but it's not so great and rarely helpful for rotations because it adds unnecessary values to the channel box. So here, if I rotate on the z-axis, let's go to our item here, to our transforms. If I rotate on the z-axis, you can see that all of my rotation values are shifting. But if we move to local, and let's say we move on the x-axis, you can see that only the x rotation moves. But that being said, neither of these two modes is actually true to what's happening in the background.
Wait, what?
I know, well, they're given to us as a visual aid to make animating more intuitive and quicker. But gimbal space is the only one that represents what's actually going on inside the gimbal ring. You can see when I move the y-axis, the red moves with it, but the blue axis actually stays in place. So pay attention again, I'm rotating the y-axis up. The red one moves, but the blue one stays in place. The more I rotate the y-axis to the right here for this example, the red axis gets closer and closer to overlapping with the blue. Now, once the red actually overlaps with the blue, and keep in mind this is happening underneath the local and global, you don't actually see this happening, but once they've overlapped, we've officially lost one direction of movement. We're now stuck in 2D space instead of 3D, with 2 axes performing the same action. When looking at the channel box, you can see that when we try and move the rotation in this direction, either only the Z orientation moves or only the X, since they're both facing the same direction. So if I select it again, it's only the Z. If I try to select it again, maybe from this direction, there we go. Now we only got the X. So you can only rotate in this direction in either X or Z, but basically 1 out of your 3 rotations will not move anymore. So you only have access to 2 rotations when rotating in that direction. This is what's called a gimbal lock, and the only way to get out of this is by rotating along the y-axis first. Now, it might be hard to picture because as humans, we can move our wrist in any direction, but you have to remember that computers use numbers to calculate motion. They need information from all 3 axes to know which way the object should rotate. Everything in the mechanical world, from robots to rockets, uses gimbals to solve rotations. Okay, so now that we got into this unpleasant situation, let's see how we can fix it. I'm just gonna Control Z this until we're back to where we were, because we actually have a gimbal lock right here in this animation file that we made. So here's a clear gimbal lock happening with the 360 spin until the hand's in the same direction again. Now, if you go to your channel box, you can see this drop menu which says X, Y, Z, Euler. This is called the rotation order, and it affects the order in which the computer calculates the rotations. Changing it can be very helpful if you're experiencing frequent gimbal locks. The X, Y, Z means that if you move on the X-axis, the Y and the Z-axis will stay unaffected. Moving the Y-axis will also affect the X-axis, but not this Z-axis. And finally, the Z-axis will affect all 3 of them. So if you're having gimbal trouble, you can help yourself by changing the sequence. You can play around a bit to see which order works best for you once you run into issues. Having the Y-axis first in the sequence helps preserve the ability to twist the arm, because the Y-axis will always be available and not locked. Same for the head, to be able to move side to side without any issues. Now, quaternion rotation does not cause any gimbal locks, but I would avoid it because it's not that great for animation and it might give you unpredictable results. You want to stick to the Eulers, unfortunately. I would say that changing the rotation order is actually one of the more extreme solutions that you could do because it's permanent. Once you change it, it will affect that controller for the entirety of your animation. You can't key the rotation order, so use it only if everything else fails. Another built-in tool to help fix gimbal issues is the Euler filter. Let's look at what's happening in the graph editor where the flip occurs. So here it's in the rotation, and let's add all 3 rotations in here, and if we zoom in, you can see that we're going in one direction and then we're flipping completely into the other direction with some of our values going over 360. So instead of it being one straight line, because the arm should only just be slightly rotating, instead we have these crazy curves going up and down, and with the red going all the way down, when really it should be a fairly smooth and straight line on the rotations. What's happening here is that we're going from, let's focus on the z-axis here. We're going from -24 value to all the way to 372 positive. So that's like a 390 degree difference, or even 400 degree difference between these two values. So that's source of the problem. Now, what you can do is actually select all of your controllers. Here I'm pressing A, press A again, and what you can do is you can go to key and go all the way to the top until you find the discontinuity Euler filter. Pressing this should usually fix your problem. So here we have something like this, but we don't have a 360 degrees happening anymore. So we pretty much solved the issue we were having. And as you can see here, we go, the highest value we go is 22 on the z-axis and -165 on the y-axis. So we don't ever cross the 360 mark, which is really important. Now, this tool works about 80% of the time. So definitely give it a try first before anything else. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna undo this because I like pain. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna try and manually fix this with our controller here. So again, there's a couple of ways of handling this. One is clicking the discontinuity Euler filter, or we can go one by one in our rotations. So let's start with the X rotation. And what we can do is come here, and this is the X rotation. You can see we're at -380. And what we can do is we can try and match where the hand position needs to be. So, the hand is going all the way down here. And what we can do is we can select these last keys after the issue is happening and bring them all the way up until the hand is in the same sort of position it was before. Now we have this weird key in between, which then I can just, it was in between the two keys, so I'll just do the same thing. There we go. So now I'm gonna do the same thing for the other rotations. So let's go to this rotation, and I'm gonna bring everything down until we're matching before the issue happens. One more rotation to go, same thing. I'm gonna bring everything down until it's in the same position that it was in before. And I'm gonna have this as an in-between between the two. So now our issue is solved again. We don't have that flip happening, but this is more of you eyeing it, and it could kind of mess up your animation. So again, I'm gonna Control Z this and show you another way of handling this. I know this is getting a little bit confusing, but that's just the nature of animation. Okay, so now we're back to having that issue. So another way to handle this is if all else fails and you get a gimbal lock despite having the most optimal rotation order, this is what you can do. You still have access if you go to the UI. And again, in the UI, you have access to the sub-controllers for the arms, we have sub-controllers for the torso, and also the legs. So tons of sub-controllers for you to mess around with if you need to. This is almost like an additional animation layer. So if two axes lock, you lose the ability to move in a certain direction. you can use the secondary controllers to get that axis back. So here, for example, you can see that the gimbal, this is our main controller, you can see that the gimbal with the y-axis and the z-axis and everything just isn't aligned with the controller, because I want to rotate along the angle of the controller, but that's not where our rotations are. So what I can do is then click on the sub-controller, and as you can see, our gimbal controllers are perfectly set and there's no Euler issues happening. Now this is, again, kind of risky because you just have to remember that you have keys there, and eventually you want to zero them out once you get out of a gimbal lock on the main controllers. So you're not always animating both the sub-controller and the main controller. So while you're in the gimbal lock, you could maybe switch to the sub-controllers. And then once you're out of a gimbal lock, you can try and zero out these sub-controllers and go back to animating with the main controller. It's kind of a juggle game, but that's just one ways of dealing with it if you really don't have a choice and none of the other stuff has worked. All right, so even better than fixing something is preventing it from happening. There are a few things you can keep in mind, but I will be the first to admit that I usually just like to animate without thinking about gimbal locks and deal with the consequences later. Maybe it's a personal thing, I don't know, but that's just how I operate. So of course, the first thing you can do to prevent gimbal locks is, instead of local or global, straight away moving to gimbal and start animating in gimbal. This way you'll immediately see if you're having any issues and you can make adjustments. Since there are some limitations to animating in gimbal versus local, I know it would interrupt my train of thought, but I know a lot of animators who do use gimbal. Another solution is to animate in local space, and from time to time change your stepped blocking either to linear or Bezier interpolation, and just scrub to see if everything's looking good. This way you can catch and easily fix issues early on as you're making your poses, and if something there happens to be an issue in stepped mode, you can just zero out the rotation and repose that body part quickly without having to mess around with the rest of the animation. Because if you don't check as you're animating, you might notice that after the blocking is completely done, and so you have to deal with it for the rest of your animation. And the final thing you can do to prevent flips is keep an eye on the graph editor curves right here. This and the channel box. Again, you want to make sure that you don't go into the super high values like 370. That shouldn't happen. You should never pass 360. It's better to check everything regularly and catch things early on, rather than struggle to fix things later when you have a lot of delicate poses in your file. So I hope this lesson helps and saves you some time and explains how these issues happen. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next video.